So now we can get started with our conversation. And this is our last meeting on The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. So anything and everything is up for discussion. We'll be focusing, the conversation takes us there on the last chapter. But again, it's a conversation between us. And so wherever you guys would like to start, feel free. If you have a page reference to share if it's what particular edition of the book it is, so that everybody will be on the same page. And I know there's folks who also listen in audio. That's cool too. It's okay if you didn't finish it either. Like if you didn't get to the last chapter, because there was a lot of reading. So wherever you are is cool. Like we don't need to necessarily finish, like start from the last chapter. We can start from wherever you are. An observation,
Michelle,
a question, anything.
Hi, this is Kagiso. Michelle Alexander was pointing out how the imprisoned, incarcerated people, even amongst our own people who were professionals, were just ignored. They weren't their rights and welfare were not taken into account, and that it just reminded me of back in the day, civil rights movement and other freedom fighter movements that too many of our people did not continue that fight, but they had their education and then they became professionals and they became like they felt themselves above people in the street, and so that's something that I think we have to be aware of, that we're all together here, that nobody is above because you have an education or a good paying job. So some people sold out, and maybe they didn't do it consciously, but they did it.
Did they sell out or did they live the American dream?
Or what?
Did they sell out or are they pursuing the American dream?
Both. Both. I mean, it's okay to be professional, get educated and all like that, but don't forget our people,
So on page 280, she says, with all deliberate speed, civil rights organizations became professionalized, in quotes, and increasingly disconnected from the communities they claim to represent. Then she goes on to quote legal scholar Derek Bell, an attorney. So she's commenting, this is what happens with the civil rights movement. Does anybody have, I wonder if there are any organizers here present, whether you used to organize back in the day or now currently organizing, to speak to this, or anybody who maybe has worked in social justice, like nonprofits. I wonder if anybody is willing to share stories if they have that experience. But in my experience as a national field organizer, that was my first organizing job. That was one of the moments where I realized there needs to be a different approach to how these national organizations are doing the work. Because often there's a critique of national organizing and local organizing and how that feels differently in terms of being connected to the people you're advocating for. Yeah, but I agree with that observation and critique, Kagiso, and I welcome anybody else to have something else to say around that.
Yeah, I can at least talk from a organizing perspective because I've been in a couple of different, prison abolition groups and the nonprofits that are in that world. I mean, the whole reason the nonprofits are able to exist and get funding is because they're in a way complicit with the state to begin with. So it relies on that professionalized class of people who are willing to, you know, quote unquote, sell out because, you know, they're making pretty good living, a lot of them. And the people at the top are making a very good living in the nonprofits. And, you know, you have to wonder, well, how invested in the community are you really if this is the kind of money at play? Whereas the more radical people, we're dealing with people organized with groups that, you know, quite frankly, are broke or have very little money to go around for their causes. Because if it was, you know, if they weren't radical, they'd have a lot of money. That's the point, basically. So it's like, where are you prioritizing? They'll like to put a face and say, oh, well, we of course highlight the community, but a lot of these nonprofits, they like to tokenize people, whether it's formerly incarcerated people, put them up front, you know, seemingly, but when it comes to making decisions, they are not taking input from the community.
I worked at one of the cure violence sites in one of the 18 cure violence sites in New York. And
what is the cure violence site? What is that?
It's the whole purpose of them is to interrupt violence, interrupt people who are about to commit a crime or people who are about to become a victim of a crime. And generally, what they tend to do is hire formerly incarcerated people. They make the central team, and those people basically work the streets in different neighborhoods throughout the city. The one that I worked with was in the heart of Crown Heights, came out of the Crown Heights Mediation Center. But the organization on top was the Center for Court Innovation. What I found as a person just working there administratively was that the folks working the street had a lot of street credence and were able to have a certain amount of impact and inroads to people in the community. But on the flip side, they did not have the management skills. They did not know how to do certain things. So there were pluses and minuses, and they were set up as management, and they were not really very good at it, and it was very painful to watch. And it felt more and more like a failed project. And what I observed was high turnover, and in some cases where they fail, even the people on the street. You know, and they had gotten smarter about how they worked the streets. So they didn't try to cover as, let's say, a larger territory, but they also, you know, I felt like they needed to build their teams 10 by 10. You know, you might have, you know, 15, 20 people working, you know, a certain number of blocks in Crown Heights. From where I sat, that wasn't enough people. And money was being poured, like de Blasio poured a lot of money into the cure violence sites. But I still felt like the model, like, you know, there needs to be yet a different model. I think the formerly incarcerated plus people who, or whether they're social workers or other types of workers, needed to work hand in hand with them. Because many of these folks were still working out their own issues. They weren't experts, but they had a better sense of things. But I still saw it as a failed project. And I watched like an over 70% turnover in a 2-year period, which said that this is not working, you know.
Wow.
But those are the, you know, I'll shut up from
still open? No.
Are the programs still open?
Yes, there's still
secure violence program.
The one I worked with is called Save Our Streets. And they worked in conjunction with another local group called Repair the World, which was a Jewish organization. The most successful of them was a group that was in Brownsville. They were, they were a sister office, and they were highly effective.
Yeah.
But mostly because they had really good management, and they really took care of the guys on the street. It was mostly, it was 99% of the people on the street were men. And they were all formerly incarcerated. It was a good idea, but I'm hoping they had very skilled social workers, but they all looked out for each other. I just felt like they needed to, like, let's say we had a staff of 25. I felt like we needed a staff of 100. And then they might have a better chance of actually really doing some serious impact. 25 people's not enough,
It's my understanding that organization, that the one that was based in East New York, like while they were active, there wasn't a murder there for like almost 2 years or something like that. And they were partly credited with that. Like that early intervention that prevented incident from escalating into what could be like gun violence or
No, they were a lot of places. They were really effective. What they weren't good at was keeping staff, and they weren't good at the guys were supposed to be nonviolent, but we had like 4 instances where staff were like facing court cases because they got caught somewhere with a gun. And I took calls from people who were afraid of staff who had threatened people, So they needed some work internally. Their street work was good. It wasn't 100%, but it was decent. I just felt like they needed more team, more people, not less.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, how do they recruit these folks? They're recruiting them from the folks that are on parole, or
they were recruiting. You'd had a core group of people who were bringing their friends, bringing folks that they knew, and some of these folks already had reputations of their own, so they would try to recruit people from there might be an SOS in the Bronx or a different kind of organization in Harlem, and some of them were more just had more infrastructure and more support, because the reality is they were putting their lives on the line, and they were trying to keep their credibility. Anytime the police would come in and try to make partnership with them, and they don't want anything to do with the police, because that would kill their reputation on the street. I just watched some really good people fizzle out, on petty stuff. So they needed work in terms of like staff development and staff support. But they were good ideas. If I had to go in and rework it, I would bring in a lot more people.
And I think
so. What it sounds like, what happened, Ron?
Go ahead, Steph.
I was gonna say, so what it sounds like from y'all's personal stories, from both Jacqueline's and Greg's and myself, is like the intention to kind of start these sort of interventions through organizing or hiring people from the community often gets caught up either in bureaucracy or funding problems, or high staff overturn, burnout. These are all common. Most of the ways that, these grassroots organizations work, specifically with organizers, you see, the overturn and the burnout is one of the key things that happens in organizations, of just kind of like shuffling people out, but the most effective ones actually tend to have like, you know, a core staff of organizers that usually know what it is that's going on locally and can report back. But I think the motto itself is kind of lends itself to be in this sort of like, I'm going to be advocating on behalf of those, but not including those in the planning or like in the strategy or in the goal setting of whatever mission or vision the organizations may have. It's rare. But one organization that I can think about that does do that is Picture the Homeless. They're a really dope organization that actually advocated for housing, affordable housing for homeless folks. And this is an organization run by and for homeless people. It's called Picture the Homeless. And I used to do work with them when I was working at in land access advocacy work. So we partnered often with Picture the Homeless to think about how to convert vacant lots into like, you know, spaces that actually nurture the community, like community gardens or cultural centers and things like that. So I think of them, I think about BYP 100, which is a organization, national organization that organizes using a Black feminist queer lens, was founded by queer Black women. And they focus a lot on youth organizing and racial justice and like gender justice, which they're really dope too. And to be honest, you know, I'm speaking from the Northeast, which I've mentioned this before, where like, if you want to start an organization or anything in the Northeast, it's usually easier to fund something that's started here or on the coast than it is, let's say, in the Southeast or the Rust Belt, for example, like the middle of the US. And, you know, I have to be honest too and say that like the organizing done in the Southeast is the best organizing I've ever seen and I've ever been a part of, you know, simply because of how little resources exist in the Southeast institutionally and like structurally in the cities, like just the infrastructure of the cities. You could tell the city doesn't give a fuck about its people just by how the buildings look, you know, just by like the fact that there are no public resources, there are no like Medicaid or anything like that in some of these states, specifically Georgia, since, you know, everything with the election that happened with Georgia and like the organizing on the ground that happened with Black women voters, like that speaks volumes as to how powerful organizing can actually be if done well. What I think Alexander is speaking to is the professionalization of it, of like these attorneys trying to like use these issues to kind of one up their careers. So,
Yep.
you know, and the thing is, no one goes to organizing trying to make money, you know, and that's also part of it. Like, if you're going to be an organizer, you know that you're not necessarily going to be balling out of control. Like, and, you know, that's a conversation around capitalism, because a lot of times these organizations that have these really lofty missions do not apply like their own like economic justice lens to themselves. Like, you know, they don't do like a salary audit to see like if staff is being paid, you know, equally, or, you know, things like that don't necessarily happen at all.
I saw a lot of inequities, and as an administrative person, I was paid incredibly poorly, and my guys who had gone to jail were being paid way better, getting all types of perks. There were all these like hidden perks they were getting, and people, you know, all kinds of donations and things came in, and gift cards and all types of stuff. Many things they didn't talk about. So there was all this double standard, triple standard stuff going on. And the person on the top was we had an organization that was, let's say, 98% people of color, and then we have a white woman sitting on the top. And she had she was so poorly prepared to be there. And it was painful working with her. She was so inept.
But can I ask you a question, Jack?
Yeah.
Was she financially connected?
I don't know how she came in there. She came in. She was one of the original organizers that came out of the Crown Heights riots, right? And so that's how she got in her position. It was, and you know, she would fire everybody, and then she turned around and got fired. It was like a big laugh to me. You know, my copy of the new Jim Crow was given to me by her, and every time she wrote with respect and love, and I was like, it would have been great had you had some of that, my legacy to them was to teach them how, they will wait to near the end of the fiscal budget. So June, you have $200,000 you got to get rid of. And these guys used to take the money and buy like food and new uniforms and shit. And I said, why don't you get some technology? Why don't you get this? Why don't you get that? So I taught them. I feel like my legacy was to teach them how to spend their money more wisely. And get y'all sitting here with old ass computers. Let's get like 24 laptops for them. I just couldn't take what they were doing. And they did hear me. They did shift how they spent their money, but I can, when I left, there was some really good people in place, and thank goodness a good portion survived. And it's largely the people who are on the social work staff. Those were amazing people. I remember one day a guy came in talking about demons, and I had my head down and I looked up and I said, oh my God, he's really out of his mind. And the social worker took him in the back and worked on him for 90 minutes, and a different person came out the room. And I said, you're a magician, So they had some incredible people with incredible skills. I couldn't take them. I had to get out of there, but I'm hopeful that maybe in the next 5 to 10 years they will evolve and stabilize. I have been observing them throughout the pandemic. I'm still on their email blast list. And so one of the things I see them doing is every week they give out free groceries to the community. The blast is bring your shopping cart and fill it up with groceries. So I feel like that's an important service to the community during this time.
Yeah. Do you think Michelle Alexander was criticizing organizations like that? Because in many ways, that your organ or the organization you work for exists partly because of a prison industrial complex.
Mm-hmm. I can't say that for sure, but I saw that they made it easy for folks who had been incarcerated to get jobs. I was hired along with 3 other people. 3 of us are no longer there. The person who stayed was a young man who had been in prison for like 24 years, mostly on trumped up charges. He's a beautiful, brilliant young man, and he was able to find a way and hold his ground. And he's actually running the Bed-Stuy office of Save Our Streets. While they lost, let's say, 80% of that office, and he was one of the people that was able to hold on. And I'm hoping that he can stay there and grow and stabilize. But they made it easier for folks who had long records of incarceration to get employment. And people, I mean, my supervisor was the head of the Bloods for Brooklyn, which made me laugh because one day I looked up, and I'm going to shut my mouth because one day I looked up and I said to him, I said, is this a blood house? and they all laughed because they were all former Bloods, And, my other supervisor had killed someone and did 13 years in prison. And I was like, what the hell? How the hell are the 2 of us together, We did our best.
This was a while ago, the Osborne Foundation, I didn't know what the Osborne Foundation was then. They contacted me to do a couple of workshops on Rikers Island. Rikers Island, I don't know if they still do, but they actually had a literary review magazine on Rikers Island.
Wow.
called Rikers Review, I believe. And I didn't realize how big of an organization the Osborne Foundation still is, but they exist partly off of government funding. You know, like they get contracts and they go into the prisons. So like, but I mean, they do that, but they also help people recently released from prison re-enter society, which is, you know, noble, and then that's a good thing. But there's also that aspect, again, to go back to what Michelle Alexander was talking about, you know, there is an industry that is based on prison. And the legal system and lawyers who are involved in the criminal justice or defendant system, they are also benefiting from this system, and it's huge, you know. So like, what happens? Well, let me rephrase that. Are all of those people who are trying to fight for people in prison willing to lose their job if, you know, if we do away with prisons?
Right.
Even though the politics of it would say, yeah, they are liberal people and they want to, you know, they don't want people to go to prison. But in actuality, if your mortgage is based on this man going to prison, how hard are you going to fight to change that system?
Right.
But there are people, lawyers who are fighting, you know, I mean, they're not earning, you know, a big amount of money, but they're fighting in order, you know, they take on cases, individual cases, you know, of people who can't afford to get a lawyer, and they do fight for incarcerated people. So they're not in the system. They may be in an organization or some kind of bureau, but they're not in the system. They are fighting. So there are some people who are doing that.
Even if you're not part of the Department of Corrections, but you are being funded by the city and the city's relation to incarcerating people, then you're part of the system, really.
Yeah, but there are people who are not funded by the city, you know, who are not getting money from the city. Yeah. And even the ones who are getting money from the city, there are some people who have, you know, blocked all the restrictions that the city places on them.
Yeah.
You know?
We keep coming back to the fact that it's a systemic thing, and that, like, yeah, there may be individuals who may be different or may not necessarily fit neatly into Michelle Alexander's narrative, but what she keeps gesturing is that it's the actual system, that whoever is in that system is complicit at the end of the day, whether or not their individual actions reflect that of, like, you know, someone who believes in the nonprofit industrial complex or the prison industrial complex. Regardless, they're still in it, you know, they're still helping the wheels churn for it to keep functioning at whatever capacity, just like how we talked about. I think Alexander is like tackling like different aspects of the system, right? So she went in on, you know, the court systems and went in on judges, and now I think she is like critiquing the attorneys that consider themselves to be parts of grassroots movements and like are naming their roles in changing the tides or whatever like grandiose language, you know, they want to use at this moment in time to describe social change. But like, she's naming that even those people are complicit, and like the whole thing is like rotten, basically, is what I'm interpreting. Except she's not using like prison industrial complex. I think that she's committed to capitalism to an extent.
That's the key. I'm the system. I mean, but I don't know exactly how we are going to change that. I really don't know. I want to change that, but I want that to change. But and then suppose we don't have any of these people fighting for, you know, fighting against mass incarceration, even if they are funded by the city. I mean, suppose we didn't have anybody. That, you know, it would really be a bad situation.
I just shared a few links in the chat for you guys to look at actual organizations in the Southeast and also based in the Southwest and in Chicago. So areas outside of the coast that I think is really important for y'all to like know that a lot of the major work is happening outside of these coasts, outside of the East Coast and West Coast is where the real work I think happens. And so mijente.net is like a Black and brown, like grassroots organizing sort of group. Snap for Freedom is a Black trans woman led organization that advocates for safer communities outside of police in Atlanta. And I put the names of like the folks who lead that. So Toni Michelle Williams is a brilliant Black trans woman activist, Marisa Franco. Then I also shared Pro Georgia, Tamika Atkins, very key and, you know, worked really close with Stacey Abrams in Georgia. And then Southerners on New Ground, Mary Hooks is another really visionary leader who started the Bailing Mothers Out for Mother's Day, the Black Mamas Bailout. So she started a campaign to fundraise to bail out Black mothers for Mother's Day a few years ago. Started with her own story of having to fundraise for her own legal fees after being falsely accused. So, you know, I think a lot of it is about, you know, stepping outside of where we are and like knowing that there's lots of notes to be taken from outside of what's happening here in our cities. Just because like New York City at the end of the day is a bubble. Like it's not really the reality of what the rest of the world, rest of the country is facing. But yeah, Toni
The Fortune
Michelle
Society.
E says
That's
the
good.
attorneys, defense, and prosecutors build friendship with the judges, and they sort of play a give and take that usually benefits everyone involved except the client. Okay, E. Yeah, E's. Thank you for sharing those comments, E. But yeah.
I wanted to say in New York, the Fortune Society, they help formerly incarcerated people, you know, in terms of housing, in terms of work. And there seems to be no glass ceiling because, you know, people who they can, you know, rise up to teachers or administrators or whatever, you know. But they, I mean, it's just one group, but they seem to be doing good work.
But why do we need a Fortune Society or Osborne Foundation if we truly address incarceration? They say if you, and I think Michelle Alexander references this in the book, that the large majority of drug case, the large majority of cases are based around drugs, and within drugs, a lot of it is marijuana. So if we just kind of like scratch off all those folks who are in prison because of weed, like,
right.
does the prison population immediately drop by half or 60%? And if it drops that drastically, do we then also need a Fortune Society or an Osborne Foundation? We definitely don't need so many prisons. I mean, you know, we have prisons in almost every borough, at least we used to. Now they're just, at least they were just building out Rikers Island to no end, but now they've stopped that. So it's just interesting, like where all these kind of like side industries going once we truly commit to decarceration, I guess, disincarceration.
Abolition.
Well, she talks about it in the chapter about how even if trying to decarcerate, she quotes, I think, someone, a warden or some, not a warden, but some commissioner of prisons. And the idea is that there's way too much already invested in so many prisons being open that the idea of closing them would produce such a backlash from all the rural communities that rely on it for jobs and all those other vendors that we keep talking about, that, you know, actually closing prisons seems like such a far-flung concept because of how much money and manpower is invested.
Something has to be done if they're going to legalize weed and the majority of people are going to prison because of weed.
Well, that's the other thing too, is like, I don't think we're not, it doesn't, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but if you're releasing all weed offenders, it is not going to cut down the prison population by like 50, 60%. That's like a misconception that, oh, all these harmless people are in there for weed. It's like, we need to reckon with the fact that people have committed violent crimes. And if you are an abolitionist, at least you don't believe that they belong there and that there's got to be some alternative. So it's really reckoning with the more serious crimes of violence, of harder drugs, which depending on how you feel about that. Didn't some state just legalize like every drug or decriminalize it last week? I forgot even what state that was. So it's really looking beyond just, oh, he, stole a loaf of bread. Oh, he just sold some weed. It's, well, we really need to look at big picture that people are inside for some serious stuff, but there's got to be alternatives to addressing it.
But most people in prison are not there for violent crimes, really. I mean, I don't know how many people are there.
A very large number are, though.
No, I'm not. I don't know how many people are there just for smoking weed, but most of them are not violent offenders. And then what happened to the rehabilitation? There used to be, like college, high school, college classes, different things to help people not to better themselves intellectually, emotionally, and not to come back to prison once they're outside. But those things have been wiped out, So the idea is to keep the people in and to keep them coming. That's it.
Well, the whole thing is that the prison system is a business. And if you've ever seen the movie Waiting for Superman, they actually touch base on it, where they're already deciding how many prisons are going to be made in the next 10 years. They base it on 4th and 5th grade students that are 10 years old, and they see how many of them are doing well and not well. And they already know how many jails they're going to make. So if 50% of them are flunking, then that means in 8 to 10 years, make 50% more prisons, because they're all going to go to prisons. So it starts even from very young. The teachers already start looking at you and saying, yes, I'm going to work with you because you need to go to an Ivy League school, or you need a scholarship, or you get teachers who already give up on you. Like my cousin, he unfortunately went through the school system and they didn't even realize he didn't know how to read. He didn't know how to write, And of course, eventually he ended up in prison because of it. So they just keep pushing you through. And if there's not someone who's going to stick with you and motivate you and keep you going, you think less of yourself. And, you feel like someone when you're in the street. So it starts from 4th grade, 5th grade, and keeps on going.
And they get that message. You better believe that they know how they are valued. And I saw it I don't work with youth that much, but I work with some youth writing poetry in one of the local libraries. And the funniest thing, my most gifted student was the one they kept putting out the library. And I was like, how do I intervene for him? And, I looked up and realized that he already knew what his future looked like. He managed to communicate that to me. Anyhow, on to the next thing.
But wouldn't we be able to solve those education issues if we shifted funds from the prison complex to education? I mean, if education is suffering for lack of funding, I mean, isn't that partly the answer if we just shifted our priorities from incarceration to education?
I think that's a big step, but I don't think it's the only thing, though.
Yeah, it's not the only thing.
Yeah, but I think it's a big step. And to get good teachers. I mean, in our neighborhoods, it's the inexperienced teachers that come there, and most of the time, and so and some teachers who really don't want to be there and really don't teach the children. I'm not saying all of them, but it's too many of them. So it's getting the right kind of education for our children. And to show them
secret,
and to show them and you know that they have value, that they're bright, you know. But if they're looked down upon and like you're not going to amount to anything, that's what, you know, that, like the sister said before, that's the way they're going to go, you know.
A lot of secret Trump supporters as teachers in the public school system as well, believe me, as far as that goes. And it's also a matter of not relying on philanthropy either to save us, because there's plenty of examples of that. Whether you're talking about that demon Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook giving some laptops to, you know, if anyone knows Sousa here in the Bronx Middle School, giving laptops to the Newark public school system as well. It's like not relying on the billionaires to bail us out with some, you know, fancy technology, as opposed to truly investing in these schools with, like you said, teachers who are actually experienced.
This is Rick. This is Tara's husband.
Hey, Rick.
Hi. I just wanted to chime in and just say a couple of things here. Number one, we're talking about, you know, reforms and the system and so many different things here. And it reminds me of listening to Brother Khalid Muhammad when he was saying, to say it's the system is like saying it's the web and not the spider. So I think, you know, as we're talking about these things, we're looking at it from the wrong perspective, because we're not in position to make certain decisions that can cause us to have any kind of reform, because you can't reform without removing. That's just my opinion. A lot of things that we're doing now, we really don't have a position or someone at the table that looks like us that can be a part of making sure that we come out on the better side of the argument, whether we're talking about incarceration or anything else. Because everything that we're trying to do has to go to someone that doesn't look like us, that doesn't represent us, and hopefully that they'll make a decision for the betterment of Black folks. That's just my opinion.
Of course. But how do we change that though? Like if when I hear, and I know I've heard other people say, you know, that same thing, but how can we affect change from where we are, knowing that we aren't those key people or those key individuals to, you know, to make change? I thought voting and democracy was supposed to sort of guarantee that.
Well, I agree with that. That's a very valid point, because I think that what we have to do in our own communities, we have to understand what it is that we need. Once we understand what we need, and then we need to put things together, because look, we have predominantly Black communities being overseen and legislated by predominantly non-Blacks. You have white district attorneys, white judges, white police chief, mostly the white lawyers. These are not the folks that can basically represent us in a way that we need to affect change. So unless we get, you know, boots on the ground and start from the bottom up and start looking out for ourselves, because we do need to understand the significance of voting. We pay attention to presidential elections, but we don't look at local or state. Once we do that, because we need to have, back in 2016, there was, they had this list that everybody had to sign. And they were saying, listen, they wouldn't raise taxes for the rich, the Republicans. They all had to sign this document saying that they wouldn't raise taxes on the rich if they wanted to be nominated for the presidency. I think we should have the same thing in the Black community. I think we ought to have a list of 5 top things in the Black community. I'm talking about worldwide in the Black community that we can agree on, because we have a strong voting bloc. We do. People don't think we do, but we do. It's not the fact that we don't have a strong voting bloc. We as Black folks, we just suffer from the mindset of credulity. That's one of our biggest problems. We believe things without doing our own research. And politicians love that, especially those that don't look like us. They tell us what we want to hear. We vote for them, they get in office, and then they do what they want to do for the betterment of themselves, is basically keeping their political need on our backs. And if we don't understand that and come together and do that, all these other things, we're just going to be spinning our wheels, and we're just going to be having meetings about other meetings, about other meetings, about other meetings.
Thank you.
I agree. Yeah. And some of the politicians that look like us who are not doing the right thing by us, we need to get rid of them too. So there's some right in the Bronx, that are out for themselves and not really for the community. So we have to really be very scrupulous to see what the background of the people, backgrounds of the people are, and test them out.
Thanks, guys. So I shared in the chat breatheact.org. The Breathe Act has been shared oftentimes. I think every week we speak, right, somebody drops in the Breathe Acts. So I just wanted to name that I actually know a few of the people who wrote the policy, and, have been like comrades with them in reproductive justice movement specifically, but they do work, across all policy and specifically racial justice as well. And so I just wanted to shout them out and invite you to click on the link. I know that because of how history tells the stories of social movements, there always are these sort of like outstanding like actors, and these sort of like demigods of leaders that we tend to create of our leaders. We tend to make them into these sort of like unreachable, unattainable, sort of like godlike sense that an everyday person can never believe that they have the power in themselves as well to do something to change, their community. And I think that like part of what I guess the Breathe Act is trying to mobilize around is kind of imagining outside of what we have seen and known, and like, asking specifically to divest like federal resources from policing and incarceration and ending criminal legal system harms. There's a section on investing in new approaches to community safety and utilizing funding incentives. There's also a section on allocating new money to build healthy and sustainable and equitable communities for all people, and holding officials accountable, and enhancing self-determination of Black communities, including like community land trusts and things like that I had mentioned before. So I wanted to invite people to check that out. And you can become a community co-sponsor. You can sign it. You can advocate for this bill to be passed. In the website is a Take Action tab, where it invites you to kind of think about how you can be part of this greater movement. And I think that it's important to kind of, fit in where you can fit in. If there's something that you truly care about, there's always a way to be involved. And definitely don't underestimate how much power you have in just a conversation and talk to your neighbor about this. You know what I mean? Like that's really how the culture of this changes, because what I think Alexander really is naming is there needs to be a cultural shift in understanding how we understand, the prison system and incarceration and folks who have been formerly incarcerated, Liliana commented, the tremendous advocacy that happens during elections, either for local, Senate, or presidency, is driven. However, it dies when a candidate is elected. We need to make sure that that drive continues even after a candidate is elected. The real work starts after elections. Yeah, I agree with that.
It has to continue locally.
It has to continue locally. It says E shares, if we can formulate the argument, we can send it to the politicians, the DAs, city officials, HR. We need to raise a ruckus about the lack of representation in this mental system that doesn't also look like us. Yeah, and you know, now people are really hyped because of Kamala Harris, right? You know, because, oh, wow, Black and brown women, and we're really like invested in identity politics right now, and as a culture. And I think I always think about Zora Neale Hurston, and she said, all skin folk ain't kinfolk. And I think that that's something that applies in any sort of setting, you know, from Obama to now, to Ruben Diaz Jr. and Ruben Diaz Sr., to all of them, to Richie Torres, to all of them. I'm calling all of y'all out. What's good? You know what I mean? Because at the end of the day, you know, they really ain't shit. I'm sorry. And so, like, you know, it is what it is. It is what it is. And, you know, this is why artists and culture and literature is so important, because it really massages our imagination to really imagine something outside of this, you know? And that's really what I think, in the most attorney way possible, I think she's trying to tell us this, but with like her proofs of like a case study after case study after case study, that this does not work. She may not necessarily have named that, but I think she invites us to really imagine something else, especially because she references Baldwin at the end, the fire this time or whatever. You know what I mean? And she is the new Jim Crow. So she is building upon like a legacy that Jim Crow has, but she's naming it something new. But is it really new? I don't know. Seems like this is just a new face. AOC, I mean, yeah, I'm in AOC's district, so that's interesting too. AOC is accused of not serving her community too. Yeah, I mean, we welcome AOC to the book club, though.
She follows me on
She
Instagram.
follows us. Not for nothing. I was telling my friend Paula earlier, like, the first person to follow me on Twitter is Barack Obama. And I was like, this is when I was named like Latina Feminista, like back in the day. And I was looking at my Twitter, because I'm hardly on Twitter, and I'm just like, wait, this man follows me? Oh my gosh, like, what is this? But yeah, it's true. It's the get cool. I feel like it's an app following me for real. That, I don't know. I struggle with I'm struggling with social media, but you know, yeah, that is a thing. But you know, tweeting is now a new way. You know, we have to really embrace the times that we're in and not shy away from like anything that really stirs your heart. And like, if you feel angry, if you feel like, oh, like this shit really pisses me off, like I want to fucking do something, that's excellent. Like, you need, like Sarada the earlier weeks had also been on this wave of like, no, like we need to remain angry. This is not something for us to be calm about or like complacent about, specifically now, because now, you know, we have Biden or whatever. The complacency, and no, Americans love to be comfortable. So we like, oh, we're good now.
But, you know, with this election, I mean, I'm glad that, you know, there's a Black Asian sister as vice president, but we have to look at, you know, she's not perfect now. She did some dirt, you know, back in the day, and not too far away. And she's part of the system too. So we have to watch her very carefully, as well as watch Biden. You know, he's the one who, you know, really has the power. And I think that individuals and groups have to demand that he address the ills of the society. And most of us are facing the ills. So he has to address these things, you know. We can't just say, oh, you know, he's in and Trump's out, which is, hopefully. But we really have to have our foot on their necks, because otherwise it's the same thing over again. I loved Obama, but he got the money from, you know, all of these corporations and politicians, etc. So he was part of that whole thing too, you know. I mean, he did do some good, but he still was part of the whole capitalistic system, and these guys are too. No.
That and this chapter comes full circle with the election, at least, because starting in 313 is when she talks about, you know, Obama's cabinet, and she calls Biden one of the Senate's strident drug warriors. She talks about Rahm Emanuel being the chief of staff. He helped push the drug war, and now we're seeing Rahm Emanuel will likely be in Joe Biden's cabinet. And even after this was made, which was 2010, he went on to be an awful mayor in Chicago, covering up the murder of Laquan McDonald and all the other things he got into. So really everything comes full circle. The faces that were guilty of this stuff then are just, they're at the fore now. I mean, one of them is in charge of the country, and he's going to be putting people like Emanuel in office in addition to some other awful people. But it's like, it makes you wonder, like, okay, what ground are we really gaining here?
All we can say is at least he's not Trump.
It's a good point. Which does go back to, you know, making sure that we put pressure on them. I mean, one of the things I'm most excited about with this election, it was the way that people were engaged, and I'm hoping that engagement will translate or be transformed into into like local action, or doing some kind of collective work to continue to put pressure on them. There is the possibility that Biden will bring the same old players back to the table that were in the Obama administration, for better or worse. And I think the difference will be the amount of pressure that the people put upon them. I'm hopeful that all the good energy, the dancing in the streets and whatever, will be transformed into everyday work, or on a local level and a national level.
But it feels like we were here after Obama won. Like we were in this same joyous, transformative place. And then Obama went and deported more people than any president could ever imagine.
Right.
So what's gonna happen with his vice president now?
What worries me is, with all this celebration is, you know, people go back to that colorblind state that it was when Obama came, like, oh, we have a Black president, so that means that we're no longer racist. You know, and seeing that Biden, you know, serve under his command and such, like, people, you know, get too comfortable, forget that there's a pandemic and everything that is going on. Like, that's what I'm, like, you know, skeptical about. Like, people will go to that kind of habit and sit there.
I don't think they can, because we are in a pandemic. I think the pandemic is the wild card in the game. It's one of the wild cards. And if they don't get it right, talk about being in a repetitive loop. You know, they got to get it right in the next year. It'll be interesting.
You know, I think, you know, for me, just to use an analogy, I think it's wrong to blame the superintendent, the principals, and the teachers when you're not doing anything for your children in your own home. You know, so what I mean is we're still looking so high up at what other folks are not doing, and we're not really doing anything in our own communities. Until we start talking about what we're doing in our own communities and taking this energy and putting it in our own communities, we shouldn't be looking so far ahead, because a lot of people complain about these higher politicians just because the fact that these are a lot of people that, you know, they want other people to do things for them. They've always had this mindset. And as long as you think like that, nobody who's going to get into office, who, I don't care who it is, you're looking for somebody to be your rescuer. You have to, in a lot of cases, you have to make sure that you cover down for yourself. We're talking about Obama, we're talking about Biden, we're talking about Trump. These folks right here are running in a whole totally different lane. There's a whole group of folks that we need to be concerned about before we even get to that level. And that's my problem with what we're talking about now. We need to make sure, and I keep saying this, and I mean, hey, everybody, I respect everybody's opinion, so I'm just giving mine. We need to start looking at our own communities first, organizing within the communities, and then taking what we have and then moving it forward. That's just my opinion. I think we're just looking too high at a certain level, and we're not even taking care of what we need to be doing. You can't complain about somebody doing something outside your home when you're not even taking care of your own home first.
Brother, I agree with you, but I think we have to do things simultaneously. You know, we have to, you know, take care and look and evaluate and try to improve or whatever our own neighborhoods. But we also have to look at, you know, the governor, the mayor, the governor, the president also. So I think we have to, or maybe some people just take care of the neighborhoods, and then other people in conjunction with them look at the people on the higher levels.
I'm not going to disagree with that.
Yeah, it's about me.
You know, you know, I'm not disagreeing with that, and you're right. And once again, when I said that we have predominantly Black communities being overseen by predominantly non-Blacks, I'm talking about the governors. I'm talking about the mayors. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about the chief of police.
Right.
I'm talking about the judge. I'm talking about all these folks. We need to make sure that we represent us. And yeah, there's some folks that look like us. They don't represent us because they just trying to make sure that they get to that place where they think is going to be comfortable for them. But what I'm saying is we need to organize within our own communities, and a lot of these things we can change. Just because they build these prisons don't mean that we have to occupy them. We need to quit. We need to discontinue to create opportunities for others that's causing us discomfort. That's one of the problems. You can't, our defense can't be when they have something already in place, because we already see you can have a white person and a Black person that commit the same crime. The Black person can get 30 years, the white person can get 2 years. Our defense can't be where you gave this white person 2 years. That's not a defense because you committed the crime. You just created an opportunity for somebody to cause you discomfort. The problem is not to commit the crime, so we have to deal with those things locally, that we don't have to commit these kind of crimes, because the prison, listen, prison, it is an industry. Poor is an industry. Ignorance is an industry. All these things generate revenue. So we have to look within our own communities and change things, because once we change things on the inside, which comes with changing our minds and how we do things, then we can do things better. Change the mind, change the game.
But don't you think that oftentimes Black people are going to prison for, and I would put crime in quotes, that white people don't go to prison for? I mean, that's one of the big issues that Michelle Alexander makes in this book. It is not the actual crime, but it's the punishment for that crime, where white folks often get off for what Black people go to prison for. I mean, she's kind of clear that Black people they definitely aren't consuming any more drugs than white people, but they're going to prison at 10 times the rate as white people are. So it almost feels like no matter what you do, the police, this system is going to send you to prison. You, Black man, Black woman, is going to find a way to get you into prison because they have a certain number of beds to fill. and they're not looking at everyone equally. They're looking at Black bodies as criminals and white bodies as, I don't know how they see white people, to be honest. I know they see Black people as criminals, but Black people are, definitely going to prison for the same crimes that white people get off on or get off from.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I totally agree with that. But here's the other side of the equation. We have to look at those who are sentencing these Black folks. It's not Black folks. So that's what I'm saying. We can't do reform without removal. Mm-hmm. If we really want to reform, we must remove. Because you have a lot of these folks that they're getting all this information, everybody's protesting, everybody's trying to figure out how we can do things differently. I guarantee you the folk that are making decisions, they don't mind people out here protesting all this kind of things, because they know they're still going to be in their positions to be able to render whatever punishment that comes, and they can decide how they want to punish depending on, justice has never been blind. She's always had that unique ability to peer through that blindfold and see color and render her decision differently based on that color. So what I'm saying is we have to ensure that we don't just turn ourselves over to this system. Once again, it's the folks within the system a lot of times versus the system itself. Because once again, if I commit a crime right next to a white person that commit the same crime, they give me 20 years and they give him 6 months probation, I really can't blame the system as much as I can blame the person who said, I'm Black, so I'm gonna get more time. So what we need to do, in my opinion, we need to change how we think, how we do things, because there are a lot of impediments here that causes us to go down a path that leads us to the criminal justice system. But we don't have to necessarily fall for that. So what we have to do, we have to train the trainer. So we have to have folks that understand. And listen, I think a lot of this we have, and it may be off topic a little bit, but Black men, we play a strong role in our communities. We have to be involved in our communities with these young brothers and these sisters and change their mind about how things are done, because a lot of our young brothers and sisters are being raised, in these environments, and they just don't know better. And the folks that can teach them better are incarcerated. Mm-hmm. And that's not a good thing for us. Mm-hmm. That is not a good thing for us at all. So what we have to do is make sure there's a saying that they attribute to Frederick Douglass. That is, it is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. I don't agree with that. Because how can you build strong children without an assembly line of responsible men? We must have that. So that, for me, is a big part of what we can do for ourselves. Because if we can do that, then a lot of these things that are impacting us in a negative way when it comes to prison and all these other things, we can change that if we change what we do. Because once again, just because they're building these prisons does not mean that we have to take resident there.
Thank you.
Yeah. On my way home this evening, I watched a group of young Black people who were sitting at outside having drinks at a little restaurant, end up in a major altercation with the wait staff and watched a white woman and a Black man fighting each other. He ends up on the ground and he's trying to hang around. And I'm like, get out of here. It's not going to be a discussion about who did what right or wrong. You're going to go down, And it took a minute for him to get in the win. He had done nothing wrong, but I was like, this is so ugly, just get out of here, And it was very bad. People may do the right thing and they still go to jail. I'm not trying to counter what you say, because I think what you're saying is important. But I do feel that we need to be at the power table throughout this entire culture, throughout this American structure of government. We need to have a place at the power table. We need to be in the room. You can't impact on what happens if you're not in the room. If you're not agitating at the table. And I do think that we need to be, and, you know, some of us need to be in the room when they're talking about how they're going to spend the money. I mean, they continuously bail each other out. They continuously bail out the 1%. You know, we should be able to put pressure on Biden so they don't do the same old thing, you know. Or they may come close to it, but let's get some of that. Let's get what's ours. You know, we built this damn country. They, you know, they owe us something. We should be able to demand something from them and get it. And not let it be the slave's dream or the slave's wish. We need to demand something of the power structure continuously. You know, and yes, work on our neighborhoods, but I'm like, you know, we need to be in the power room. If you're not in the room, they don't give a hoot. They don't really have any obligation to remember you.
Yeah, that's been the mentality that has driven most social movements at this point. Is, oh, if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. That sort of attitude. And I don't think that's gotten us very far either, because I've seen people who've gotten to the table and begin to order like anybody else. You know what I mean? So I think that there has to be a balance. Like, I think that's what you guys are speaking to, that there needs to be, yes, like an approach inside and then also like on the grassroots level. But one thing I want to name too that the book, you know, fails to do is around gender specifically. And so when we talk about, you know, those right now in this moment in 2020, in terms of the rates of who is actually going to prison at higher rates is actually Black women. And, you know, this book doesn't speak to that. So I really would encourage people to really examine your opinion through a gender lens in this particular moment, and to understand that, like, though the book does write a case study specifically for how Black men are specifically being funneled and shuttled into prisons in many shapes and forms, at this present moment, it's actually Black women who are not only, you know, being killed at really high rates at the hands of Black men, but also now going to prison at very high rates. And so, like, I think since it's 8:30 and we want to wrap this up with like something to think about in the future, something to position us to be in a way to help not only continue these conversations with your neighbors in your community, but also think about, okay, how else can we work differently? How else can we learn from past social movements and their failures so that we can better inform how we want to move in the future? And so I think if you're really passionate and want to like make a change, it's about meeting people where they are. So, you know, if someone is for the first time voting and this is like their first time being engaged in civic engagement and they're really passionate about voting, then you know, meet them where they're at. All right, you think voting is great? All right, let's talk about how else you can be engaged in your community. There's also other things that you can do outside of specific civic engagements. You know what I mean? If someone is like, well, I love volunteering at the polls, I just feel like that's my way of helping out in the community. Like, it's really about meeting people where they're at. And if you're genuinely committed to liberation in some way, shape, or form, it really isn't that hard. Like, it really just begins with like opening yourself up and being vulnerable and sharing, like, this actually angers me. I actually am moved to do something about this. And, you know, sharing that vulnerability and sharing that anger with one another is really important, especially when you want to move and do something with it. You know what I mean? And yeah, I think that if anything, this book really shows us that not much has changed. And now that we're such a crucial time historically in this moment that will be studied, I'm sure, over and over and over again from future generations. You know, how is it that you want to show up for yourself and your community? You know what I mean? Showing up for book club is one way, as we have had such rich conversations these past 5 weeks, and like talking to one another and like learning from one another and hearing people's stories and opinions is one way. You know, we can continue doing this work, you know, here at book club, because these conversations really are transformative and like really are powerful that we get to have every week. And it's definitely a privilege to have it with you all. So, you know, I can encourage you to continue to have these conversations with your community and continue showing up for book club and using literature as a way to have these conversations, you know.